The Grid of Ghostly Silence. The Hook. In 1849, while the rest of the world was sprinting toward the California gold rush, a small band of men was ordered to do the exact opposite: walk into a dead, white void and measure it with a literal chain. They weren't looking for gold, they were looking for nothingness. What they found was a landscape so silent it caused men to lose their minds, and a salt-crysted reality that defied every map ever drawn. This is the true account of the Stansbury expedition, the most meticulously documented, boring descent into a terrestrial purgatory in American history. Part 1. The Mandate of Dust. The orders arrived with the dry snap of official parchment in the humid air of Washington, D.C. Captain Howard Stansbury of the U.S. Army Topographical Engineers was not a man of romantic flourishes. He was a man of the decimal point, the transit level, and the heavy iron chain. His mission, handed down by a government desperate to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, was deceptively simple: survey the Great Salt Lake. At the time, the lake was a myth wrapped in a rumor. Trappers spoke of a whirlpool that sucked ships into the center of the earth. Maps showed it as a speculative blob. Stansbury's job was to replace the myth with math. On May 31, 1849, the expedition set out from Fort Leavenworth. They carried with them the heavy baggage of civilization: sextants, barometers, chronometers, and thousands of pages of blank ledger paper waiting to be filled with the mundane coordinates of a wasteland. There were 18 men, 5 wagons, and a sense of duty that felt more like a slow-motion sentence. Part 2. The Crossing of the Monotony. The journey across the plains was a study in repetitive exhaustion. While the 49ers passed them in a frenzied, chaotic rush toward the goldfields, Stansbury's team moved with the methodical pace of a funeral procession. Every day was the same: wake at dawn, check the livestock, measure the distance traveled, and record the temperature. By the time they reached the valley of the Great Salt Lake, the heat had become a physical weight. The Mormons had only arrived 2 years prior, huddled in a settlement of adobe and hope. But Stansbury wasn't there to settle, he was there to measure. The first time he looked out over the lake, he didn't see beauty, he saw a logistical nightmare. The water didn't ripple like a normal lake, it was thick, heavy with brine, and an eerie, translucent green. The shores weren't sand or soil, they were a crust of biting, caustic salt that shimmered like a hallucination under the desert sun. This is where the boring becomes legendary. Stansbury decided that to map the lake properly, they had to circumnavigate it, a feat never before accomplished by land. Imagine the scene: a group of men, dressed in wool uniforms and heavy boots, dragging a 66-foot Gunter's chain across a flat expanse of white salt. There are no landmarks, there is no shade, there is only the rhythmic clink of the metal links and the scratch of a pen in a damp notebook. The salt was so thick it formed pillows that would collapse under a man's weight, plunging his legs into a black sulfuric ooze beneath. The smell was a mixture of rotting brine shrimp and ancient minerals. They moved mile by mile, recording the elevation of every minor rise, the depth of every stagnant pool. To the American audience, this is the ultimate anti-Western. There are no gunfights, there are no outlaws, there is only the terrifying, quiet persistence of human data collection in a place where nature clearly didn't want to be measured. Part 4. The Mirage and the Mind. By October, the heat turned into a deceptive, shimmering haze. The men began to experience the great mirage. Because the ground was so flat and the air so hot, light bent in ways that broke their instruments' accuracy. A small sagebrush would appear as a towering forest. A coyote would look like a giant on horseback. Stansbury wrote in his journals with a clinical detachment that becomes chilling the more you read it. He notes how the salt would crystallize on the men's eyelashes until they looked like ghosts. He records the exact weight of the salt they gathered, the specific gravity of the water, and the way the silence was so absolute that a man could hear his own heartbeat as a thumping drum in his ears. One afternoon, their guide, Jim Bridger, pointed toward the horizon and claimed he saw a mountain range that wasn't on the map. They marched toward it for 6 hours. It never got closer. It was a projection of the atmosphere, a literal nothingness that they were trying to put into a ledger. Part 5. The Winter of Brine. When winter hit, the boring story turned into a survival horror of the mundane. The lake didn't freeze like fresh water. It slushily congealed into a jagged, icy sludge. The expedition was trapped on the western shore, miles from any fresh water. They survived by boiling the salt water and capturing the steam, a process Stansbury recorded with the same dry precision he used for everything else. October 24. Water brackish, men fatigued. Measured 3 miles today. Observed a new species of gull. It is this juxtaposition, the life and death struggle recorded as a series of bland observations, that makes the story so haunting. They were literally counting the steps to their own potential graves.